right, welcome everyone to your next session. This session is What You Say Matters, How to Make Your Course Inclusive to All. It'll be presented to you by Christina Velez and Natalie Bolton from Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska in the U.S. Christina Velez is an instructional designer with Creighton University in Omaha. She's earned a BS in secondary education English, her master's in English, and a master's of science in education in curriculum and instructional design. Natalie Bolton is an instructional designer at Creighton University as well in Omaha, Nebraska. She earned her BS in elementary education and a Master of Science in Education in Curriculum and Instruction. So now I hand it over to both Christina and Natalie.
Good afternoon. My name is Christina Velez. As I was introduced, I am an instructional designer with Creighton University. Unfortunately, my colleague Natalie Bolton could not attend today, so our other colleague Liz Davey has agreed to help present with me on our presentation. Liz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Starting off with, unfortunately, I'm not Natalie Bolton. It would have been great, but I'm just me. My name is Liz Davey. I have experience and background teaching in K-12. I was a high school English teacher for 11 years, really covering all facets of classroom curriculum design, implementation, lesson planning, etc. And just recently, about 2 years ago, became an instructional designer with Creighton University.
Wonderful. So I've spent nearly 8 years in higher education, either as a tutor or as teaching. I've been with Creighton for about two and a half years now. What Natalie and I discovered working with our faculty, trying to put courses online in a very quick amount of time, is that the pandemic showed that there needs to be a change for how online teaching and how online course design is created and implemented to help students engage with the content a bit more effectively. We will not be presenting in a traditional slide format. We actually created a Canvas course to help model the different types of online content design that you can incorporate in your own classrooms. We do want to stress, however, this is not criticizing nor shaming. We are simply providing suggestions and recommendations that we have found our own faculty to really appreciate. So to get to the course, you're welcome to either click on the Inclusive Course Design link or go ahead and scan the QR code. Otherwise, you can also go to bit.ly/inclusive and equity to get to our course. Okay, I'm hoping everyone is there. Not everything in this course is going to be discussed because there's a lot of extra resources and examples for you to peruse on your own, but we do want to encourage you to check everything out on your own time. So Liz will now talk about universal design for learning.
Can I actually do something? I'm going to turn this chair that way. Go here. And of course, I can't see myself, but I'm going to hope that this is okay. All right. So hopefully this will pertain to both audiences. Am I okay in profile? Wonderful. Okay. All right. I am going to apologize right off the bat if I seem to be reading a fair amount. Like I said, I'm stepping in and filling in for my colleagues, so I do apologize if my presentation skills are not as good as what maybe they could be or should be. So let's scroll down just a little bit here. How do I scroll, Christina?
You have to use the,
Okay, got it. Okay. When it comes to course design philosophy, the most comprehensive place to begin is with the concept of universal design. Universal design is the cornerstone of inclusive course design. So originally, the term universal design came from a man named Ronald Mace. He was an architect, and his basic philosophy, which he applied to products and physical spaces, was to make things usable, creating things in such a way that anyone, no matter their abilities, no matter their background, would be able to use it. And all of us here are not so unlike architects ourselves in that we're creating learning experiences for students. Mace based universal design on 7 key principles, but in summary, his central tenets were that one size does not fit all. Retrofits are expensive and limited. It's easier to design things well up front than to go back and make changes. And also design that benefits all users, not just certain subgroups. And a great example of that would be the handicap door opening buttons that you see at the entrance of buildings. Those are essential for those who have mobility challenges, but they're beneficial to anyone who's approaching the door of a building and has their hands full with kids or books or bags or whatever the case may be. So the motto there is really essential for some, but good for all. Okay. In the early 90s, a research and development organization called CAST, which originally stood for the Center for Applied Special Technology, and they're just CAST now, conceived the idea of universal design for learning by applying those universal design principles from architecture to education. So the goal of universal design is to remove barriers from a physical environment, and UDL is the elimination of barriers from the learning environment to encourage flexibility and include all learners. Their approach shifted that focus from the disabilities of students to addressing the disabilities of schools or learning environments. So minimizing barriers and maximizing learning, which is a little bit of a paradigm shift depending on, when you came into education, what your background is. Universal design for learning is the result of a collection of evidence-based research from a variety of fields: education, special education psychology, educational psychology, neuropsychology. Essentially, it's the philosophical foundation of good, solid pedagogy, no matter what you're teaching. These ideas of UDL apply to both in-person and online learning environments, but we're really looking to capitalize with the online learning environment here. The 3 core principles of UDL are multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. So I'd like to give just a brief explanation of each. So multiple means of engagement, that's the why for learners. Why are they doing this learning? So that involves developing student interest, purpose, motivation, and self-regulation for learners. And because people are motivated in different ways, this concept of intentionally incorporating student choice can be really valuable in an online environment. That could look like allowing students to choose the tools and resources they might use, allowing them to have a choice in what they will produce to show that they've met learning objectives, and maybe even the order that they complete tasks. Principle 2, multiple means of representation. This is the what of learning and providing multiple ways for students to access your content. Again, we know that students differ in the ways that they perceive and comprehend information. For example, learners with visual impairments. If those students were made to use only a printed textbook, they would struggle or possibly even fail to comprehend that information due to the way it's delivered. Students with differing backgrounds in language and cultures are going to perceive and comprehend information differently. If you think language barriers, Christine is going to address that a little bit later in the presentation. And students with various cognitive circumstances or educational experiences are going to perceive and comprehend differently. Something as simple as a learner with cognitive difficulties might just need to see content more than once in order to process it thoroughly. In all of these different cases, the means or the method of representing the information can present barriers to students' understanding. So multiple means of representation, what that might look like, that can be offering PDF documents that can be read by a screen reader, offering textbooks and materials in audio and multimedia formats, recording lectures so that students can rewatch them later, and providing hyperlinks and footnotes for students to expand where they'd like to. The final principle of UDL is multiple means of action and expression. This is the how learners show that the content is understood. Thank you. Definitely trying to address 2 audiences at the same time.
Right. Okay.
All right, so the idea here is to provide multiple opportunities and methods to show that students have met learning goals without lowering expectations. And how people can show their learning varies for various reasons. An example, I was an exchange student in Brazil when I was 16, and I went there and learned the language by full immersion. I really didn't have a lot of preparation at all. So in school, if I had to show understanding of a concept strictly through language, whether it be speaking or writing, I am pretty sure that I had the grammatical equivalent of a toddler in Portuguese when I was speaking. And so I don't imagine I sounded that intelligent. But if there were other ways that I could show my understanding, animation via tech, drawing, even acting something out, I can still express that learning without the language becoming a barrier. So that's kind of a way to think about it. Another great benefit of having multiple means of expression is that learners can model for each other various ways of expressing their learning. CAST created some guidelines, which are linked here, and I'll let all of you, we have a lot of resources here that you can go and attend to later, and I'll let you do that. But the guidelines can be used as a tool for implementing universal design. The guidelines really just draw attention to areas of importance or concern without being really rigid or prescriptive. It's more about, again, reminding you of things to think about. So in summary, universal design for learning is an approach to teaching aimed at meeting the needs of every learner. It promotes having flexible aspects of learning, from how instruction is delivered to how students demonstrate their learning to various ways of nurturing student interest and motivation in learning activities. In this presentation, we're talking about making courses inclusive to everyone. And UDL can be very helpful for students with specific learning needs, but more importantly, it minimizes barriers and maximizes learning for all learners. All learners benefit from an inclusive environment. And I love this motto, and this is a great way to sum it up and think about it. Essential to some, but beneficial for all. Now, specifically, when it comes to course design, I'm not going to go over every single one of these suggestions here, but I would like to highlight a couple of items from this list that we often recommend or encounter when we're working with faculty. Remember with our online courses that the goal is to make content easy to access and easy to navigate. So one highlight I'd like to make here is consistent navigation in an online course environment. Easy course navigation is really critical. That navigation should be consistent, logical, and efficient. We want to look at reducing the number of times users have to scroll and click on things in order to get to them. A beneficial addition to your course to make sure that students know how to operate and navigate is to make just a course tour video. This is also a great opportunity to set the tone or the climate of your online learning environment. Ultimately, that clear, predictable, consistent structure, it lends a sense of security to your learners and creates a course climate of safety, which helps students feel comfortable and welcome, and thus opens them up a little bit more to the challenges of your content. There are not barriers about getting around, and they can focus on what you're teaching. Another item that we'd like to highlight here are students that might be using a screen reader to access content. There's a few specific design details that might help them with that. First of all, using structured headings like text-style headings allow a student that is using a screen reader to click and tab and navigate through content a little bit more easily. Also, using concise, meaningful links, we call these descriptive text. Screen readers will read every single character within a URL. And so we want to avoid putting that in there. I'm sure you've all seen, course or URLs that are this long. Okay. So it's not necessary to say link or links to or goes to or click on, because the screen reader is going to indicate that to the student. So just use text that specifically states what it is or where it's going to take the student. Ultimately, with all of these items about course accessibility, just think about how comforting it would be for a student with accessibility needs to come into your course and it already works. They don't have to take that step to alert the instructor that they have needs. They don't have to take any extra steps that way. And also, it's good to remember that learners don't always have to disclose that they have a disability. So if we create these courses in such a way that they work ahead of time, that doesn't become a barrier to learning at all. So I've discussed here a few best practices for designing learning experiences in general, also some points regarding accessibility for those who might have ability limitations. But there are also things to consider when your goal is creating a learning experience that's truly accessible to all, and that's equity and inclusion. So I'm going to hand this off to Christina for equity and inclusion.
Okay, thank you, Liz. So one aspect of UDL that we do want to include is the idea of equity. So if everyone could please take a moment to complete a very short quiz, and you can get to that either from the homepage of the course or by clicking on this link or this QR code. And we'll just give you a few moments to, if you have devices, go ahead and use it. We'll just give you a few moments to complete it. It's very short. And again, this is not meant to criticize or shame. It's just an exercise of providing some recommendations.
Interpret test results and manage unforeseen events, taking into consideration critical contextual factors such as never counted, scarcity of resources, and tools that these impacting factors.
Oh, of course. There we go.
Storytelling techniques.
That's okay, of course. We're just being flexible. Okay, if you're still providing responses, feel free to continue to do so. We're just going to go ahead and move along for time. Okay, so based off of these responses, this survey was created just to kind of show what assumptions educators make in general about what their students may or may not know right up front. So the question about office hours, it seems that the majority of respondents said that yes, they already knew what it was. Asking about an image, it seems about 50-50 to tasty snack or a meme, which is kind of expected. And then these different phrases or these different idioms or local colloquialisms, it seems that majority seems to understand that it's a regional local idiom. Okay, but we do also have a response that says never heard of them. And that's where we're coming from, is this idea that not all students are going to recognize local ideas, metaphors, phrases right off the bat. And that can be from a student not local to the school or a student that has grown up and spent all of their life in the same area. So we originally created that survey because a colleague of ours is from the Midwest, where Creighton University is, and Natalie and myself weren't. And we didn't understand the context of the phrase oatmeal versus steak. We didn't understand what she was referring to. And that's just one small phrase in a larger team meeting that sort of created a barrier for us to understand what she was trying to say.
Do you want to know what oatmeal versus steak?
Yes.
So our colleague uses that phrase all the time, and it has to do with like expectations versus what's really available. So oatmeal is going to be like simple and basic, whereas steak is like luxurious and amazing and the best that you can get. It's maybe no surprise that a Midwestern phrase categorizes steak as good as it gets. So we're from Omaha steaks. There you go. There's connection.
So for those of you who may not have quite heard online, it's a phrase that means what someone expects a program or a tool to do versus what it physically can actually do. It's meaning the oatmeal is less effective or less useful. Okay, so I'm going to talk about inclusivity and equity, and these are very hot topic, a bit controversial buzzwords that are happening everywhere. But again, this is not meant to shame or anything. It's just meant to provide some information and suggestions. At the end of the day, all educators need to do is adapt and make changes to learning content to achieve inclusive and equitable learning environments. And that seems fair for all students, removing those barriers. We want to create a welcoming classroom from the learner's viewpoint. And one of these ways is by self-recognizing and self-acknowledging our own biases. Project Implicit is a nonprofit organization that conducts research in social behaviors that helps helps users to better understand their own biases. Okay, so this could be anything from what do you think of the color blue to more controversial, more important ideas or events that are happening around the world. I highly encourage everyone to check out that this test here, the implicit association test.
And really, like Christina keeps emphasizing, we don't want to portray the message that certain biases are good or bad or otherwise. Really, when it comes to those biases, it's just about being aware of them and being intentional and thoughtful about it when you're designing your coursework.
Yes. So one of these biases that kind of led to that office hour question on the survey is during Anthony Jack's TED Talk. I'm not going to play it, but about at the 5-minute, 20-second mark, he talks about being a first-year college student coming on campus and hearing the term office hours. He admits that since he was a first-generation college student, he assumed office hours meant a time for faculty to conduct their own work, not a time for students to meet with them. So changing the terminology that is used in the syllabi from office hour to perhaps conversation time or meetup time or let's chat, that's a very simple way to create that welcoming environment. We have other videos and resources here that provide some more examples, including maybe a welcoming statement in your syllabi or inclusive discussion board and writing assignment prompts that can help students feel more comfortable talking with you. Okay, so back to the biases and diversity identifiers. Again, very controversial, hot button topics that are happening, but I want to emphasize biases are okay. It's the actions that denote a potential negative event. Okay, biases are not necessarily a bad thing, whether they are implicit or explicit. Biases are simply our brain's way of categorizing and organizing information before we commit an action. So an action can have a positive connotation based on a bias. For example, being polite when meeting someone new in American culture usually meant shaking of hands pre-COVID. In other cultures, perhaps it's a kiss on both cheeks or a hug or something else. Here in America, we work off of a bias, though, that it's a shaking of hands. So whenever there are students that may not be familiar with that, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad bias. It just means we need to be a bit more open-minded and self-reflective to incorporate those student needs. Okay, diversity. We categorize diversity into two terms. A big D diversity, which includes broad identifiers. These are someone's race, gender, socioeconomic status, primary language. We also consider the little d identifiers, which are much more narrow ideas. So where the student grew up, was it urban, was it rural, are they local, did they travel halfway around the world to attend your class? Do their personal experiences match the majority of students in that classroom, in that learning environment? Do they have personality preferences? Are there more introverts or more extroverts in your classroom? And what self-motivating factors do the students present? So what does biases and diversity identifiers look like in learning content? Well, we focus here on language that's used. This is just one example that's very easy to incorporate in online learning content. And an English proficient speaker may not understand local colloquialisms like I did not, However, that doesn't mean that there is a connection between the proficiency level of the language and the ability to prove learning mastery. Okay. The reason why this came about is that my colleague Natalie, she was speaking with one of her faculty members and provided us a great example. This health sciences faculty member was speaking with a student who's not originally from the United States. And the faculty member mentioned the term baby shower in a case study for an assignment. This student assumed that baby shower meant a literal showering of babies or a party to shower babies. And sure, we can sort of giggle a little bit about it here, but that's kind of the case. And that automatically creates a not necessarily friendly environment for the student. We have lots of other phrases that show the origin and meaning. And one of my favorites is the German, "you have tomatoes on your eyes," because I could never imagine that. And it has a general meaning of you're not seeing what everyone else is seeing. And I think that's very appropriate in the education field. Some other ways to incorporate this idea of biases and diversity identifiers is considering how case studies are presented. Does the subject of the case study need to include the gender or the socioeconomic status or the language that's used? If it doesn't, then just simply remove it. It's that simple. Again, like what Liz was saying, it's easier to start creating your online content with these things in mind rather than go back and make those changes. Although we do hope that you all will go back and make some changes. Also keep in mind, as Liz was mentioning with UDL, that you want to make sure the learning materials are diverse and adaptable. So if there's audio, visual materials, that they have subtitles. But at the end of the day, you do want to just maintain clear and accepting expectations. Also recognize students have responsibilities outside of this one individual course and sort of acknowledge that, because students may need flexibility, especially during these pandemic times. Okay, so how do we achieve this? Equity is our goal. That is the goal that we are constantly trying to strive for. The first step is simply acknowledging and reflecting on our biases and then adapting. Okay, accept that biases aren't always negative. For example, you can assume students have a minimum English language proficiency to take your course based on your university standards. However, like I said earlier, making assumptions about the student's abilities, that's not necessarily right. And that is what makes a negative bias, a negative connotation. Another step is to just check in with your students, poll your students, use inclusive language. Try to be a little bit more adaptable if students request more feedback from the instructor during discussion boards. Check in with them to gauge if content or delivery methods need to change. Work with them to create that inclusive and equitable learning environment. So really, in summary, it's to meet and accept students where and how they are and challenge and guide them towards where they need to be. I'm sure that many people have seen this graphic. It's used a lot now. And I think it's wonderful because it just goes to show that if we can remove some of these barriers, it will help all learners to learn, not just those that present with those barriers. So what does equity in the classroom look like when designing assignments? I'm going to focus on the design of discussion boards. But before I do, I would like it if everyone could please click on our last survey on discussion board design. And you can either click on the link, use the QR code, or if you need the URL, it is bit.ly/survey discussion. And we'll give you all a few minutes to take care of that.
Can I ask a question? Yes. So when you said in a case study, if the role of a person in a case study is not needed, but the whole point of a case study is the case. So for example, if you're teaching Harvard School of Law, all they do is they use case studies for all of their law. But they present actual case studies like the Nixon Watergate, whatever, or the Monica Lewinsky, whatever, right? So you can't strip the case study out of the actual person because it will strip out all of the authenticity of the case study.
Certainly, yes. And we were more focusing, I'm sorry, for those online, she asked how can we separate a case study from its inherent identifiers, which is true, especially in certain fields like law. You do need those personal experiences to help complete those case studies. But in some instances in healthcare, for example, you don't always need to know the patient's gender if the objective of the case study doesn't require it. And again, this is dependent.
It's ultimately, I mean, the instructor obviously can be at discretion as to whether or not those particular details matter. So in the case of law or healthcare, that might be a very relevant detail, so you would not want to remove that. But let's say if we're working with, I have a K-12 background, but if you're working with maybe even like a younger student, and I have an example in here where a math problem is surrounded with language that refers to the NFL, and the students are not necessarily American. So if you would say, I work in the school counseling program, and we're setting up a scenario where a student, I don't know, is dealing with disappointment because he's not quarterback on the football team. Well, if a student is completely unfamiliar with American football, they're not going to know why that matters or why that's a big deal. So that's kind of the awareness that we're talking about. And again, it's going to go back to the instructor as to whether or not those details are relevant. We're kind of highlighting just being aware of that extra awareness in case taking them out is true.
I imagine an SAT exam where all students on the planet have to learn how to use the dollar, the cent, the quarter, the baseball, the everything.
Yes.
It's a very large exam.
Yes, that's a great example of it.
I suffered. Yes, exactly. So some other examples were more based around if there's a math problem, and the language surrounding that math problem is more based on Americans' understanding of the NFL program, that takes away from the actual math problem. The student doesn't really need to know that, but it would create a barrier. So thank you very much.
So it's not the person per se, it's the context. Like,
Yes.
like instead of football, you might want to use soccer, or I don't know, like, depending on your population.
Exactly. And
So it's not the actual stripping of the person, could be anything.
Correct.
Identifiers that could be misleading or uninterpretable with someone.
yes, exactly. And you are correct. It's not always about, it's not necessarily pulling the person out of the case or the example. It's about keeping in mind the context of the language that's being used. And that's why we focus a little more on the language rather than more of the hot topic things.
It's a deep subject.
It is.
There are a lot
It
of
is.
different directions.
Certainly. So thank you. Okay, so I hope there were some responses. Okay, looks like we got some responses, and we'll work off that. So this survey was a little bit more in depth. It did ask more pointed questions. And this came about because there is a lot of discussion in the education field, especially with instructional designers, on how effective and useful discussion boards are. Like, what's the point of them? Why include them in online learning content? So it's always very interesting to see these results because it looks like the majority said that they participate or encourage participation in the discussions. Looks kind of the same thing about encouraging feedback. Cooperative learning experiences. I'm glad to see that there seems to be more majority in here. Yeah, so this is great. This is really, really great. So it's great to see that there's that acknowledgement that students' personal experiences are being incorporated into the learning process, because as we all know, you can't take the person away from the learning experience. So this really helps to kind of showcase how valuable discussion boards are and how they can be incorporated into the online learning environment. But there are some best practices and strategies to consider when designing discussion boards. We all have heard the complaints that they're dry and that there's just too many of them, and instructors have a lot of other things to do. There's just not enough time to respond to students. Well, first of all, ask yourself, what's the purpose? Is it for students to share opinions? Is it for students to have critical reflection and analysis? Or is it simply yet another task in a week's worth of other tasks the student needs to complete? If you're feeling a bit more daring, you can always incorporate student facilitating led discussions where students are broken up into groups. There is a group leader for that week, and students work with each other with some minimal amount of instructor feedback, just to ensure that the students are staying on task and keeping the conversation going. Of course, we always encourage the avoiding of the procrastination, but what's more important with that is to scaffold the discussion prompts so that they have a bigger impact. They always relate back to previous content, previous concepts, real world application, because when you can have the students engage with the learning content as a real world application or something that's a bit more realistic in their minds, keeping in mind diversity, they retain it longer, they keep it in mind longer, they feel that connection to it more. So I have two examples in here of what I call minimum and maximum level engagement. So first I want to just show this minimum engagement level. And as you can see, it's pretty generic. It has an open-ended question, but it's not very interesting. It's just asking the students to describe a strategy that they would implement. There is instructions about when to post and the grade point value. That's it. There's no real way for students to know how to engage with this further. Instead, what we recommend is to use more of something like this. I know that there's a lot of information on here, but if you start with week 1, then students will be expecting all of this information and they will adapt and be able to complete the task. So as you can see with this prompt, there's a little bit more to it. It's asking students to kind of answer the how questions. How would an increase in the engagement improve? There's expectations listed in here to keep in mind that posts should be supported with evidence, but also be aware of terminology and syntax, modeling the behavior that you want to see in your own students. There's also suggestions for replying to the peers. Ask questions for clarification. Be a little bit controversial. Try to strike up a little bit of an argument in those posts. Get those students talking. And maybe also incorporate different ways of just thinking about the content. What would happen if the case or the context around the prompt was changed a little bit?
If I can throw something in on this as well, I really love the suggestions for replying, because when you're thinking about the backgrounds of your students, internationally and culturally, it would just give them a leaping off point. And these aren't even necessarily structured down in the language. I've seen sentence starters that are, I know this because, or whatever. But also the non-traditional students. Maybe you have adult partners that have not participated in discussion boards, don't feel like this is a strong student, don't know where to begin. And so it's already there and it's benefiting everyone already. So that's not even
What we usually do is instead of laying all this out in an activation post in the discussion forum, at least in our online courses, we have the instructions somewhere under assignment. Yes. Any time in this course, when you're going to engage in a discussion, these are the expectations. 1, 2, paragraphs not all, because there's a lot of text, you know. Include the image. Usually when I have to do blogs, for example, I always tell them, give your blog a catchy title, make it, you know, interesting as you're seeing. But yeah, we don't. Students are like another discussion like that. We may break here, so we're trying to spice it up a little bit, and it's especially with blended and online learning, because it does that help them articulate their understanding. I love that, but we got to get past that text.
Yes, certainly. And that speaks to UDL's multiple modes of learning and proving that Liz is going to talk about in just a few minutes. The dry discussion boards is what we want to get away from. We need other ways for students to engage with the content, and Liz is going to talk a little bit more about that.
For example, voice thread is one of
Yes.
them. I mean, I haven't really used it, but apparently it allows students to videotape sound versus text, but then you run into other problems when you do that. Because what if people don't, or can't, or you know, then what do you do? You know?
Exactly. So it's all about being self-reflective and being considerate and taking into account these different contexts and learning environments that students are presenting. But in no matter what you implement or include in discussions, they really do need to have clear expectations in them, clear instructions, and just consider different methods of engaging with the students. A lot of students do say that they like having that feedback with their instructors, especially online only students, because if they're not in a classroom, there's no way to see facial expressions like you can see here and kind of gauge the discussion that way. So incorporating students and instructor comments into these discussions is always helpful. So as I was saying, now Liz is going to talk about inclusive and equitable design for assessments.
All right. So I'm definitely under the impression that we have an audience here that is familiar with a lot of these terms, so I won't take too long going into them. We wanted to highlight right off the bat that the term assessment has definitely got a negative connotation if you think high stakes testing and those kinds of things. And traditional tests and diagnostics tend to focus on the weaknesses of the learner. And we want to paradigm shift a little bit and look at the weaknesses of the assessment or the instruction. Look at it from that almost environmental point of view. And again, also when it comes to assessment and being evaluated, keeping in mind that we want to create a sense of safety and security for the learner in order to encourage them to venture into that content. From a UDL perspective, assessment's not only about measuring learner performance, it's feedback for you as well about the effectiveness of your instruction. We've got two basic types of assessment. Formative assessments are your check-ins. In a UDL approach, the focus is on frequent and planned formative assessments, which can improve instruction for all students. Natalie used an example about thinking of formative assessment like GPS. Without it, you may or may not successfully make it to your destination, but with it, you'll likely arrive there faster and with fewer barriers. So kind of thinking if you're checking in with your students, you're going to arrive at that learning objective wherever you want them to be faster and with fewer barriers. We have a video example. Again, we'll let everyone watch that on their own. With Tom Angelo talking about looking at feedback like a coach. A coach will offer feedback, the player practices, and then they return for additional feedback. So the feedback is like formative assessment, seeing where the player is at. It's an opportunity for you to offer guidance rather than point out mistakes. Summative assessments, on the other hand, are learner performance after practice has taken place. These are things like portfolios, presentations, papers, exams. We do want to emphasize that UDL recommends multiple means of expressing or showing what learners know. So assessments that could be designed with limited means of expression might be unfair. And this is where I brought in the example of having like American references or vocabulary. That's going to limit the student showing their knowledge about, say, a math concept. I also have noticed with my daughter's work, my daughter is almost 10, and if she is asked to show her comprehension in writing, it's not her favorite. She struggles with it. It's going to be very limited, a little detail, etc. But if you allow her to do it visually, there will be a breadth of detail. It will be longer. There will be more to it. So ultimately, this is the idea that learning is learning and that it can be shown in a lot of different ways. There we go. Sorry, I lost my place. And a couple other items to remember about summative assessments or suggestions to keep in mind. Letting students have the opportunity to resubmit a summative after they've been given some feedback. Depending on your context and your details, as the instructional designer or instructor, consider, is that learning any less good because a student didn't get it on the first try? Or is it still good quality learning if we give them some feedback and let them do it again? We also talk about having, big D and little d diversity in your classroom. So giving a lot of choice or options in the assessment process can help remove barriers. Some of those barriers could be assessments that create excessive anxiety, like testing circumstances that dial up the pressure, assessments that are not engaging. I remember, again, standardized testing example, the Iowa assessments. They included an entire segment for 11th graders about trees. And I am sure there are plenty of 11th graders who love trees, but they were not in my classroom. And so showing their, reading comprehension, language skills on something that dull, it got in the way of seeing what they were really capable of doing. So that's just something to think about. And again, trying not to pigeonhole the way you show that learning in one method, like the writing versus drawing option. When you're evaluating your own assessments and whatever your learning environment might be, some good things to keep in mind, kind of 3 key questions to ask yourself would be, how is the assessment linked to the learning goal? How does the assessment engage the learner? And what barriers might students experience? That's just a good filter to have when you're looking at your own assessments in your course. We've got a video here you can watch later, but it's from Todd Rose, and he's a Harvard faculty member, also happens to be a high school dropout, who illustrated the importance and the value of flexibility in design or designing to the edges. He uses an analogy talking about the Air Force refusing to buy fighter jets that fit only the average size. Kind of that one size fits all thought. And the Air Force demanded that the fighter jets be designed to the edges. So to accommodate, for example, both the tallest and shortest potential pilots. And that's only just one dimension of these average dimensions that they were using. And the result was a boom in talented, qualified pilots who otherwise may not have even had the chance to enter the talent pool. So he brings that idea into the classroom and talking about flexibility and options when it comes to learning. Finally, when it comes to assessments, rubrics are a really effective way to detail outline expectations. It's a good practice. It allows students to know what the learning looks like, gives them a chance to choose how they want to perform. One opportunity might even be to incorporate students in the creation of the rubric itself. That really shows a lot of ownership. Natalie, who I think had a lower elementary experience, Natalie used the example of with these assessments that she would write the top level, expert or best, and then with her students, write the definitions of the other levels. Not only that, giving them an opportunity to take that rubric and then do peer reviews gives students a chance to get some feedback before they turn it into the teacher. And hopefully, we'll have better results in the end using some of those practices. Rubrics can be really overwhelming. We definitely recommend, I know this is a K-12 adage, but beg, borrow, steal. If you have anyone that you work with, if you can adapt a rubric or start with one, try that. Absolutely. What?
I have, quite a bit of experience with rubrics.
Yeah.
But, I'm not a huge fan, especially for students at a higher level, because they're limited, right? There's a limit. So how would you address that?
So something, I didn't work in an elementary background. Like I said, I worked in high school previously, and I know with the higher ed rubrics that we see, they're pretty highly developed, and this is something that people within departments will collaborate on to develop, and they'll go all the way out. Personally, when I was teaching, I felt the same way. I also felt like, as the instructor, why would I spend this much time explaining what subpar work might look like? Because I don't know what I'm going to encounter. So I would often use just a single point rubric. I would have the explanation of the expectations always tied to whatever it was that were the objectives or what was taught in the lesson. And then I would leave the, say, 3 lower, I would leave them open and make open-ended comments within there. I think your higher ed learner might be able to handle that a little bit better. Having that, it's a little bit more subjective as far as the feedback goes. But that would be one possibility. And the other thing is that developing good rubrics takes a lot of time. I know you said you have experience with rubrics. They can go through a lot of iterations. And that's another good reason to collaborate with people on the language they use in their rubrics and how they're put together, so that you maybe don't have to take as long to figure out what works and what doesn't. And it's also possible to take language from other fields than what you're working in, and make it work for whatever field you're in or working or content you're teaching. Okay, and just to wrap up about rubrics, there are a couple examples below that you can access if you get into the course that are good guides about rubrics. And I'm going to hand this off to Christina to close, and we can answer some questions if we have any.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So to close up, what we say matters. It's a very common phrase now. Pretty much everyone in the education field thinks this way. Diversity is obviously something that's being brought more toward the forefront. And it doesn't matter whether we're looking at small d or large d diversity identifiers. Students are students and need to be seen as whole people. I can't tell you how many times I've already heard just in today's conference that look at students as whole beings and construct your content in that respect, in that regard. We have this phrase, minimize barriers to maximize learning for all learners. That is key. It aligns really well with UUDL's phrases as well. Spread awareness, speak up to make change. Even if you make one change in one page of one course in your entire course load, that works. That gets the ball rolling. And then depending on what happens with your students, you can make additional changes the following time you teach it. And we also definitely recommend to take the implicit awareness test, again, just to acknowledge our own biases. There's tests just asking you what you think about ice cream or something. So it's just eye-opening and very self-reflective. So we still have some time if anyone has any questions for us.
And thank you for bringing your questions
throughout.
And I don't know that there's any expert. I feel a bit challenged by the question about rubrics. I don't know that I have a perfect answer for it necessarily.
I know. I'm really fascinated by it. I don't want to go on about it, but I could. I sort of love it. I personally, when I was in school, right, the higher you get, there's no rubric, right? There's a certain point, they just tell you how to be the wordless, and that's it, right? There's nothing. But then, I taught in college for years, and there's no way you wouldn't even get an assignment if you didn't get the rubric, because they would have no idea what to do, right? But my problem is, there are a few colleges, a few really good ones, and then there's a few terrible, and then there's the middle, right?
Yep.
I'm teaching in the middle, but I feel like I'm doing a huge disservice to the top level kids, right? And also, again, I think it's because they're putting in a box, they're not going to move beyond the box ever, right? You might get to the middle, well, I just find it so difficult.
And when you bring that up, the first thing I think of is, again, I'm jumping in here out of nowhere, so I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants. But looking a little bit, I'm curious what UDL would have to say about that, because universal design for learning is really about that teaching to the edges concept.
And you were talking about that struggle being you don't want to be a disservice to either end of those edges. So I wonder what feedback they could give us or what direction or guidance about how to incorporate that UDL philosophy into writing rubrics specifically. All of the items that we've gone over today, each of them is like their own wormhole. I mean, we really kind of bounced on the surface of the water for many of them. But I think Christina and I can also attest to a lot of, like, we bring up a lot of these items in day-to-day work with higher ed instructors. I mean, these things come up. And so it was a little hard to gauge like exactly what everybody would need because this proves pretty useful content. But maybe that's about the best recommendation I can give is UDL might be a good place to start and see if anybody's got better ideas about about how to make sure those rubrics are inclusive as well. Also, and another challenge related to rubrics is if you do offer options for your assignments, which we know is a good practice and lends to an inclusive classroom, making a rubric, like if you've got time, you can make 5 different rubrics, or you can try to make a rubric that will address, you know, the skills and the knowledge in a specific but generic form, which is a paradox, but, you know, for the logistics of data and teaching, that's something to think about too. So,
yeah, and I was going to say that, and of course, we're trying to do the best for our students, but I think sometimes too, you're so busy that, you can make your life easier, you can make a rubric that is, you can deal with and mark the paper. Otherwise, you're going to be marking for the rest of your life.
yes.
I think another suggestion that also kind of lends a little bit to this rubric is, what's most important in that assignment, especially if you use multi-modes of assessment. Is it, Liz brought up an example when she taught English to her high schoolers, is getting that citation perfect all the time what's important, or is a mistake here and there acceptable if the objective was met, which was synthesize information from this reading. If there's a mistake or two, does that really matter? So it's also dependent on the content, the course, the students, the context.
The objective or standard that you're trying to meet.
Certainly.
Like I said, in my background, that was a big part of it.
And that's why we say just do little steps. You don't have to change everything all at once. Just change one page, one assignment, one assessment, and then move from there. And we have lots of extra resources and references throughout this. So please, take the time, check it out, check out those videos. And if you have any questions, all 3 of our emails, Natalie, Liz, and mine, are on the Meet the Presenters page. So feel free to email us if you have questions, if you have suggestions, if you want to just chat. We welcome to all of them.
I don't know who you're replacing, but you're doing a good job.
Oh, thank you. That's very high praise. I appreciate that very much.
I don't know who you're
This
replacing, but
could not have happened without Christina. I mean, this is work that they've done already and they've put together. So I really it's like teaching about something.
If you didn't tell us, we wouldn't know. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
I appreciate
It's
the
very
grace.
seamless, very natural, and very intriguing and interesting. Thank you. I seem to find that the answer to every question in this thing is include your students when you design everything. I find I'm K-12 background, so it's becoming more and more interesting and fun.
Yes.
For us to say the students coming here, even why not have us body design an assessment. I mean, I would go as far as that. If you're going to, assess your friends, how would you do it? And some of the answers always go back to the kids. They're good.
And I think with higher ed instructors, we've also noticed really it should be student focused. And sometimes as an instructor or a designer, you have to let go a little bit. It's not yours. Do you know what I mean? And it's hard to say that because teaching takes so much of us as far as time and creativity and pedagogy and improving our practice and all those kinds of things. But really focusing on the student themselves. It is about them. It is about their outcome. And also flexibility. I've encountered situations with instructors that they've taught this exact same class every spring for 5 years, 10 years. It probably shouldn't stay the same. You know what I mean? For 5 or 10 years. And so that's something that we emphasize with them too, like with the flexibility to incorporate some of these UDL
ideas. I feel like a lot of these concepts have penetrated the K-12 environment maybe a little sooner than they have higher education. And I'd love to see how some of these things apply also in like corporate learning worlds, just because that's not a world that I've spent time in. And so I think that'd be
Is this presentation available anywhere? Can we have a copy or?
Yes, so you can, so the URL is up there. The easier to remember URL is bit.ly/inclusive and equity.
so and
Correct. All, no spaces, all lowercase.
And I have to point out, I think one of the wonderful things that Christina and Natalie did with this presentation is they tried to model UDL philosophies, guidelines, principles throughout. So you'll see there are links, there's multimedia. So that's another great reason to go back and visit to see how things are laid out. And of course, there's always room for more.
Yes.
It's really about just growing and being better all the time.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, we definitely thank everyone for your time if you're still here. And thank you for our audience for putting up with the slight changes. And please reach out for anything.